Center. Welcome, everyone, to the final panel discussion for today. It's art in the work environment. So in a moment, we're going to welcome to the stage moderator and art advisor, Danielle Wohl. She will be in discussion with GoDaddy's Stephen Aldrich and Maya Razon from Google about the benefits of building a corporate collection and how other companies can go about conceiving collections of their own. Please welcome to the stage the panelists.
Thank you. Hello. Hello. Thank you all for coming here. I'm excited to see you, and we're lucky to have all of you, and we are lucky to have all of them. My name is Danielle Wohl. I am an art consultant, and my clients include technology firms, foundations, medical institutions, and mostly technology clients. Specifically, my technology clients include Google and GoDaddy, two of my favorite, and also Facebook in a variety of places. Facebook and headquarters in Menlo Park, and then in a variety of places like Buenos Aires, Singapore, Mumbai, London, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and numbers of other places. I also work with companies, other technology companies like eBay and PayPal, and likewise in many different locations, Bangalore, Scottsdale, Toronto, Berlin, and other places hither and yon. Some other types of clients that I have are San Francisco General, Union Bank of Switzerland, Oracle Corporation, Hanover Page Mill Associates, and then numbers of law firms. But tonight, is it nighttime yet?
Yeah, it counts. I've seen some glasses of wine and champagne around. It's definitely nighttime.
It was nighttime for me yesterday at 4 o'clock. Tonight, then, I would like to say how fortunate we are to have Stephen Aldrich, the CPO of GoDaddy, and Maya Razon, who works with strategic initiatives at Google. And what we're going to be discussing is the effect of art in the workplace. So Stephen's job is to deliver innovative, integrated products that consumers of GoDaddy love. And Maya's job, which is also pretty interesting, is she's on the executive development team at Google, making sure that management and leadership styles work productively for her team and for their teams. So she helps her executives at Google develop and implement their visions. So what I'd like to do, and as we progress through this, each of these wonderful panelists can say a little bit more about the companies they work for, what the areas of the companies that they work for actually do, and their part in it, because they'll be able to describe it with a little bit more depth than I'm able to do. But what I'd like to do before we launch into any of that is to just look at a couple of pictures of interior spaces that have murals, because this will give us a visual sense of what we're talking about. So I'll move through them slowly. This is the same mural we saw a moment ago, but the space itself has been transformed. And the previous two were at Facebook. This is at GoDaddy. This is at PayPal in Toronto. This clicker is fighting back. I think we might all have to use our imaginations at this point to think. Oh, here we go. And these are columns that are in an all-hands room, which is also a cafe at GoDaddy. This is also at GoDaddy. These are Legos at Braintree in Chicago. And this is in Singapore at Facebook. And this is at an architectural firm in Chicago. This is at PayPal in Scottsdale, the theme was superheroes and supervillains, and this is Two-Face. And this is also a big mural in Braintree. Do you have a strong thumb? Yeah, this is good. Another detail. And this is Facebook Singapore, London, Facebook London. And that's it. Okay. So I thought what we could do in discussing how art transforms space, because both of you have real experience with that. You have experience with art and you have experience with space. We could start with a couple of questions and see where it leads us. So my first question is, being involved in a conversation is critical to building a successful product, and it's important to cultivate a supportive and effective environment. How does having artwork on site contribute to a culture and contribute to community and contribute to engagement in the workplace?
Do you want us to do a quick intro also?
Oh, please. I'm sorry, I forgot about that.
I can be brief. I'm Maya, and it's so nice to be here. I have a passion around art and aesthetics, which started quite young. I grew up in Oklahoma, and there was not a lot of access to amazing art at that time. And every once in a while, an auction would come to town, and I would go and just devour the pieces of art as they all sat around the room. And I'd listen to the auctioneers, and that's how I learned about art and brought that passion with me years later to Google, working in executive development. Our role in executive development is developing our most senior leaders and helping them build self-awareness. And so art, to me, is an essential part of that recipe. To answer your question, I think bringing art into space and into workspace in particular is absolutely essential. I view it as a provocation, as the conversation, not just a conversation starter. Something we've been doing specifically in executive development is looking at how we integrate art into our curriculum. So it's a kind of interesting take on how we bring art into the workplace is we are finding ways to take our curriculum and turn it into something three-dimensional, which ends up being something referred to as art. So that's been something that's been an exciting transformation of our curriculum as we look at taking the concepts and translating them into something aesthetic. The other thing that was surprising to me and something that I love since I joined Google is learning about some of the things that we've done to bring art into the workspace. And something that I think is such a beautiful example of trying to integrate art and technology and community is what's called the DC Mural Project. So it's our distribution centers, and we have basically partnered engineers and muralists together to transform the outside of our distribution centers in different parts of the world, and to tie together the messages of the community, the work that's happening inside the walls of those buildings, and the engineers as well. So many examples, just a couple to get started.
That's fun to hear about. I'll have to go see some of those DCs and see what they look like on the outside. So Stephen Aldrich from GoDaddy, Chief Product Officer, and I think my connection to art in the workplace started actually outside the workplace initially as someone watching PBS in the late 1990s while my wife was getting her master's degree in art history, and being mesmerized by Dale Chihuly and the first HD broadcast ever on PBS. And he had these spectacular chandeliers that he'd made all over the world and brought them to Venice and put them over the piazzas and put them in the canals. And I became a glass collector basically there on the spot. And as I started to think about the work that I did every day with my teams in technology, the question was, how do you get that level of excitement and inspiration and passion to come out of your teams? And there is a lot of work you have to do. I mean, writing code, thinking about the customer, trying to spend time working on the problem at hand, but you also need a way to take a break and to find creative solutions to problems, to find ways to connect over something not the problem at hand, but to look out into the future and perhaps not even talk about the problem at hand, and magically the solution can appear. So when we brought art into GoDaddy's offices, it was much about making sure we had spaces that were not technology driven, but in fact, connecting to other parts of our team's psyche. And not consciously, not trying to say, hey, please look at this particular piece of art and respond to it, but perhaps having a gathering space and having an opportunity for people to connect with one another, and magically, perhaps the brain is working in the background. So I think art in the workplace can do quite a bit to ensure that both engaging in it directly, engaging in it indirectly, and one dream would be to actually have people get hands-on and very tactical with the art as well, where you're creating something tactically. I'm not sure I'm using that word correctly, but making something yourself. We work so much in cerebral environments that can you take folks in Silicon Valley and have them touch and make and create something tangible?
Can I just add one thing on too? When you mentioned just the impact on the brain is something that we've been looking at really specifically in the work of executive development. So I've been so thankful to find a connection with what's called the International Arts and Mind Lab. It's part of the Brain Science Institute, which lives within Johns Hopkins Medical School. And what they're looking at is neuroaesthetics, which is looking at the impact of art and aesthetics on the brain. And so as we explore and build that relationship and look at the work and the experiments that we're doing at Google in leadership development, we're really interested to try to find the connection of creating multisensory immersive experiences and the impact that has on learning, retention, health, and wellness. And you're seeing a lot of that when you think about art in space in places like hospitals that have been doing some more experimenting a little earlier maybe than we have, but we're really excited to kind of see what we can do by activating the brain and the impact of art specifically on the brain in our work.
Well, it's interesting to hear both of you say this because you're clearly well-versed and you have a lot of experience with this kind of thing. But what was it like for each of you in working with the companies that you represent to encourage them to think about artwork in a different sort of way, to encourage them to think about investing in artwork in either a similar way or certainly similar and different ways to investing in other things that create a positive work environment and employee engagement and employee connection? How is that conversation?
Yeah, maybe I'll start on that question. When you say investing in art, one of the things to realize here is we're not building a corporate art collection. I mean, there are firms in the world who have, whether it's founders, CEOs, who bring their personal collection to work and share it. We wanted a dramatically more egalitarian approach to what we were doing. And so we wanted the artwork to be part of our workplace and part of the investment in our people. And so it wasn't Stephen bringing in his art or one of our other executives bringing in their art. It was, let's create art that is part of the workplace. And so the discussion that I had with both our facilities team, our people ops team, and the rest of the leadership team was, when we're building out the office, let's leave some of those walls blank. And let's bring in someone who can help us think through, how do we activate that space? How do we create something that would make people just take an extra second to look and engage with that particular wall that might otherwise have been blank or just a color. And it's an interesting discussion because we're about to redo parts of our office, and the facilities team and I are talking about how much do we put GoDaddy customers in the equation versus how much do we take things that are really abstracted from our daily work and bring them into the office. And so I think that's a really fun tension to say some things that you do in the office are very work directed, and I can draw a line from A to B, and other things we need to do because we're solving creative problems or trying to innovate to create the future. We have to find things that are slightly more abstract. So that was the discussion I had with our team on why this is an investment in our people and in our future.
And just to build off that, I think when we're looking at trying to create something that's never been created before or to inspire innovative thoughts, and we're stretching our leaders to do things that have never been done, the thought of not integrating art into that experience and that conversation would just be bewildering to me. So I think there's an assumption that when we open spaces and open new offices that we integrate local stories, local artists. We have a program where we have Google artists have their work displayed as well. So art is kind of integrated and woven into the fabric of how we operate. And there's a lot of Google volunteer time that goes to arts organizations specifically. I think the thing that we've been looking at differently in leadership development is how do you activate, like you were saying, how do you activate space in a way that helps support what you want to happen in that space? And if what you want to happen is to create conversation, new narratives, inspiration, creativity, then to me, art is the perfect provocation. And I would just say the other thing that we look at, and I'm really interested in learning more about myself, is environment function fit. So how does the space serve what you want people to do in it? So I use an example of the cockpit of a plane is designed to do exactly what pilots need to do in that space. You have everything there for you. You go into a yoga studio and all the props you need to fully embrace that experience are there for you. What would you want to have around you when you're in a space that's designed for innovation and creativity? And to me, of course, that's where art fits.
That's awesome. I'm going to build on that for a sec. So there's a hot topic in Silicon Valley today around gender equality and Me Too topics. Well, much of what's happening in Silicon Valley and the world in general isn't conscious bias anymore. People can't get away with that, but it's unconscious bias. And so when I think about innovation and judgment, and I think about art in the workplace, you can have a debate around a piece of art, and there's no right or wrong answer in that debate. When you're creating new ideas and innovating, and I think about unconscious bias, if you have all corporate stuff in your environment, there is, quote, a right way to do something, and that really unconsciously, I think, begins to stifle the engineering teams, the product teams. So how do you create an environment that allows people to put ideas out there with a no judgment zone around it? And I think that's one of the core elements that conscious and unconsciously we need to support the idea that we're here to do something different and do something great.
Well, it's interesting to hear that because one of the things that artists do is they take a risk. They take a risk every time they make a piece of artwork. So it draws on not just their creativity, but their courage. And I wonder if having work that always speaks to the new, because it's new in the office, speaks to courage, because it does take courage to display your vision. And I wonder if that consciously or unconsciously has an effect on people in your offices that have to innovate. They have to be creative. They have to be kind of fearless and courageous. And I wonder if having artwork contributes to that feeling of bravery.
I think so, and I'd be interested on the executive leadership side as well. But certainly, if you're not testing your ideas and hypothesizing things, many of which don't work, you're probably not pushing the boundaries very hard. So part of artwork is to try something new, to try something different, and not everyone is going to like it. In the product or commercial world, there usually is an end game, but it might take you several cycles or iterations to get there. And I think about growth mindset, and certainly when we're learning something new, those first few steps have to be encouraged. They have to say, look, it didn't work this time, but let's try it again. And so artists, while you see the finished product, having watched some of those artists in our office creating the work and continuing to iterate on it, starting here and then maybe moving there and then coming back to the first section of the piece, you can see that process visually, but you are left with the outcome, but along the way there is tremendous amounts of practice and iteration and trial and error.
It's true. Plus, for people that work in the actual workspace, they have the unique opportunity to watch a piece of artwork be made. And unless you are an artist or you're married to an artist, you don't really have that opportunity. So it's a really wonderful experience for people in the space. You look like you have something to say. No, you're just smiling.
I'm just actively nodding and agreeing with you guys.
Should we open it up to questions? Or are there other thoughts that you have that you'd like to express before we open it up? No? We're going to open it up. Does anyone have any questions? If we wait long enough, they'll come up with one. Someone has a question, yes. Oh, two people. Could we take the person in the second row first? Yes. Would you like to repeat that question?
So the question was, gosh, a lot of companies are investing in the actual physical desks and the chairs, and Herman Miller chairs, or whatever they are today, $1,000 a piece. Why aren't companies looking at art as that type of mainstream investment? You don't blink an eye when you buy every engineer a chair at $1,000 a piece and a movable desk at $2,500 a piece with a button to go up and down instead of a crank. So what would it take to get companies to think that way about art as a core piece of what the environment looks like?
I can speak to that. I think I love your question because it's a question that I ask often. And I think that there has been kind of a seismic shift, and a lot of companies do recognize that even if they don't like art personally, they need it. They need the desk, they need the carpets, they need the artwork. So a lot of companies have recognized that. There are still some that haven't. For instance, I got a call from a law firm 1 week ago. They're an old and very established law firm with headquarters in New York and a global platform, and they have offices in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is an important spot, and they've been there for 17 years without artwork. So that speaks to your question, which to me is kind of astonishing. I think there's a kind of social shift that applies pressure. Just like the way people dressed was different. Men always wore suits, and now they're not. So I think it's a similar kind of thing with art, where there's a kind of social milieu that makes that shift take place. And I think that shift mostly is taking place. It's taking place in the technology firms. They do have artwork. It has taken place in the law firms, in spite of this contradiction of the law firm that for 17 years hasn't had art. But I think it is taking place. I think it's a fundamental need. What do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think part of what is changing is that the workplace is becoming an environment to bring the best talent in and to cultivate that talent and invest in that talent. And when I think about in the past, art was maybe viewed as an elitist activity, that people collected art when you got to a certain level of wealth. But if you can bring art into the workplace and have everybody basically own the art collectively, I think that changes the equation with willingness to spend. And some of the street artists that are coming into the art scene, from at least my perspective, can bring spectacular art. They've been spending years and years building their craft, becoming really highly skilled at their work, and bringing that into a workplace makes it affordable as well. So you don't have to go buy a Van Gogh or Picasso. You can actually bring a high quality artwork that is still affordable and beautiful and causes people to ask questions. So I'm hopeful that people like Danielle and others who continue to introduce the subject of art into the corporate workplace, plus having folks see it when they go visit elsewhere, and big firms like Google and Facebook and GoDaddy and others that invest in the artwork as part of their employee experience will turn that tide, and it'll become more mainstream sooner than we think.
I would just add one thing to that, and I think it comes down to what's viewed as essential. I think a chair, I'm working on a redesign of a space, so we're looking at creating a curated space specifically for leadership development experiences, and art is part of the program. Of course, that would be kind of silly if I was sitting here and it wasn't, but I think the kinds of things when you're going through the value engineering process at the end of a project, a construction project, no one's going to question whether or not you need chairs or a desk. However, the question could arise, and it did for me, is this investment in art essential? And being able to answer that, I think, is part of the power of moving the conversation forward.
Yes.
I actually have a question for Stephen and Maya, because I want to just hear some feedback from the actual employee, because I think all of us come here because we care about art, or at some point of our lives, we got education, we got our education. So we know how to appreciate art pieces. And probably a lot of people sitting here has an art history degree or something, but most of the employees actually in tech companies, they're from a non-art background, and they probably have no knowledge about, or they didn't get exposure before, they saw those art pieces. So I just want to hear you guys, what's the feedback of the employees, how they see it. And because a lot of them would just be like, oh, this is cool, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. I mean, I think there, again, in no judgment zone, the goal is to get, for me, have something that people can react to and have something that people can sit in front of and contemplate, even again, if it's subconsciously that they're just congregating in a particular location because it feels right. And so I have maybe two anecdotes. We had an artist in our Tempe office who was creating a piece and doing it during the day. And as he was creating this piece, some of our customer care team, which is based in Tempe, was coming by and interacting with the artist. And they didn't have to appreciate his technique to have a discussion about what was he trying to do. And those discussions, when I talked to the artist later, impacted and really influenced what he wound up putting into the piece. So I think that really affected the employees, knowing this piece of art that's now sitting in their space was something that they helped create. So I think that again is dropping the barrier between art and viewer, and in this case, employee, and the space that they're in. And then the second thing, the other night we were in our space and showing some of the pieces to folks who were visiting the office, and one of our engineers happened to be sitting there, and someone asked him, hey, what do you think? And he said, I really like it. I thought it would be distracting at first, but now sometimes I'll just stop working and stare at it. And so it's not that they have to know the provenance of the piece or the particular artist. I'm happy when people ask me that question, and we're happy to tell them about it. But that's less the reason that we're investing in the art, to get people to be educated about art, and more to wind up being in a space that they like working in.
And I would say everyone's experience with art is very personal and individual, and there's really nothing, as humans, I think there's nothing that will change that. Our effort in executive development is to expose people to as much art and let them respond to it in whatever way feels authentic to them. So in an effort to build self-awareness, which one of the main things that we're trying to do with our leaders, to help them kind of navigate this unforeseen complexity that the future will bring. What are those experiences? What are those different kinds of art that we can bring and expose our leaders to? So we bring in theater. We've brought in artists to actually create art in experiences with our leaders. And we've intentionally used art, as I mentioned before, as part of the curriculum itself. So if you asked some of our participants after one of our experiences, what did you think of the art? They might not even have thought of it as art, because we're really integrating it differently than maybe a piece that you would see hanging on the wall. When I think about our Google Spaces, though, as I said, bringing art into space is it's a given. It's the price of admission, and a way that we engage Googlers in that is to help them decide what kind of art goes into their space. So what's art that's going to speak to you as the VR team or legal? So having conversations with the people that are going to inhabit the space so that they feel a connection is one of the, I'll call it a tactic, but I think it's just something that naturally has happened over time.
Yeah, maybe one other tangential thought. So in my night job outside of what I do at GoDaddy, I work with a local arts nonprofit called the Bay Area Glass Institute down in San Jose. And we in the Palo Alto Arts Center have an annual Great Glass Pumpkin Patch. We put out 10,000 plus glass pumpkins. And when I talk to my studio glass collector friends who buy Chihuly and Tom Petty and Littleton, first generation blue chip artists, they're like, who's buying glass pumpkins? I'm like, that's amazing. If someone came this weekend, we had 2,500 people go home with a handmade piece of glass. It's affordable. They live with it. They come back the next year. And that's a pathway to becoming, I think, an appreciation of art for those folks. And so if we can get just a few people in the office who see these pieces of art and think, I'd like to learn more, I think that's a side benefit. But that can happen, because I've seen it happen in one of my other volunteer roles.
I really want a glass pumpkin. My husband knows I'm obsessed with Halloween, and next year.
I know where to. I'll send you an email.
Are there other questions? Oh, yes.
I had a question related to the sort of intentional nature of art, particularly when it comes to the way that we talk about healing and healing art versus political or inclusive art. And when we start getting into subject matter topics that influence or augment our environment, how do we approach subject matters that can invent new ways of thinking about the way that the environment is in relationship to not excluding and building sort of inclusive experiences? And what are some of your approaches to not offending people in the workplace, but at the same time, building that environment that has sort of an inclusive nature?
I'm happy to answer this. Well, you look like you were about to have a thought. Okay. I love your question. I think to have artwork that speaks to a variety of experiences is important, and it's something that hasn't always been the case. So I'm not sure if your question is how is that done, like on a technical, mechanical level, but I'll answer it as though it is, and if it's not, you can ask your question again. A lot of the artists that I work with beautiful lyrical images, but some of the artists that I work with cartoon, like, I guess you would call it more of a graffiti street urban edge. So there, for instance, there was one project I was working on in Singapore with lots of artists, and this art duo had all of their cartoon figures were male. And so I said to them, as I would say to all of the artists that I worked with that worked on a figurative basis, at least make half of them female. Even if they're fish, which some of them were, make half of them female. So having an environment, a piece of artwork that speaks to more than just the male experience is really important. Beyond that, it really can depend on who the artist is and not just a dictate saying, please make sure that women are represented in the imagery that we put on the wall, because as we all know, technology companies tend to be male heavy, but even if they weren't, it's nice to have both represented. Does that begin to explain? Some?
Some of your unique approaches to diversity and inclusion.
Oh, unique approaches to diversity and inclusion. It starts with the artist. So what I just described was a duo of a male and female, but still the images were very male-centric. So it was a conversation that changed that. And then sometimes it's finding artists that are from an ethnicity that is not the dominant ethnicity, which is white. But very often the work will not necessarily say that. For instance, one of the pictures that we saw of Two-Face, that was developed by a Native American artist, but you wouldn't know it because the theme he was asked to explore was the cartoon superheroes, supervillains. So it's complex. Sometimes it shows up and sometimes it doesn't.
I would just add to that, I think part of what art can bring into a conversation is controversial by nature. And that I think in the way that we're using and integrating art, it's okay if conversation is had and people are thinking differently or challenging assumptions by experiencing the art, whatever it is, whether it's immersive theater or whether it's something hanging on the wall or a mural, as in the mural project. So I think it's hard to imagine, in my worldview, it's hard to imagine how art wouldn't bring more conversation, whatever that conversation is that's needed in that moment for us, to the forefront. So I think, I guess I think of it a little bit differently in terms of what are we trying to solve by bringing art into this equation, and how can we move the conversation forward around inclusion and diversity with art as the provocation.
Anyone else? Yes.
Excuse me. I'm curious about how, because the examples shown were mostly pop art murals. What other forms of art and how would you integrate them into the workplace do you plan on or do you integrate into your workplace? You said interactive theater and things like that. I'm curious about the sculpture or other mediums beyond just murals.
Yeah, so we've done primarily murals in the GoDaddy Workspaces. We do have some sculptures that either folks have made themselves or we go out on a team event and collectively create something. So we bring that in. And typically we haven't thought about consciously how do we create, whether it's three-dimensional, two-dimensional, theater, music, but we will incorporate in events, holiday parties, and activities where people get hands-on multiple types of art. It's a great question. I'll have to go think about it when we think about the future. What else might we bring into the space that could be unique and different? We were working within the physical perspective of how do we make the space easier to navigate, easier to work with, and that was why we stuck primarily with a two-dimensional mural form.
And I would just add to that from the Google perspective, when I think about our workspaces, yes, we have art hanging on the wall, we have sculpture, we have installations. Within leadership development, specifically what we're looking at is creating multisensory experiences, as I mentioned, and so how can we help activate the brain and have people think differently by integrating sensory experiences. For example, we brought in olfactory, so we worked with the woman who was one of the folks who started the natural perfume movement, Mandy Aftel, who's in Berkeley. She's an amazing artisan, and we've had scents created as part of our experiences. I've really been inspired by immersive theater specifically, so we've gone and sought out information and learnings from immersive theater and Broadway and looked at how spaces are transformed to help audience members engage differently and how we could apply that back into our leadership development experiences. We're looking at how to create custom curated spaces and looking at art and aesthetics within physical space. So how do you create signature experiences anywhere, anytime? And how do you take a permanent space and transform it in a way that can be inspiring and integrate art, whether it's with light, whether it's with sculpture. We did a really, we had a beautiful piece commissioned for one of our programs that focuses on really increasing self-awareness, adult development theory, and kind of looking and thinking about how you're perceived by others and yourself. And so we had this mural created made of mirror. So it's spun, and as you looked at it, you would see yourself and then you would disappear. And so engaging with the art as part of the curriculum, again, was kind of part of that. So that's been something that's been really fascinating and fun to experiment with more recently.
Oh, another question, okay.
I just have a question for you. So when it comes to art pieces, what's the difference art taste in terms of, different firms like law firms, VCs, or tech? Is in our impression, in VC firms, we always see like blue chip artists and those type of, and in tech, they were talking about murals and graffitis. Can you just elaborate it a little bit? Thank you.
Well, you've given a very good brief summary of how it is. But it's all changing. I worked with a law firm recently that we did place framed artwork on the walls, but we also installed a 27-foot mural. So there's a little bit of influence in all of these areas, and I think part of it is because the law firm is based in Silicon Valley, and one of their customers, but they have many like this, one of their clients is a social networking firm that I'm sure all of you have heard of. So they want their clients to feel comfortable in their space as well. But the technology firms generally do have murals and other kinds of innovative work, and the law firms have just gorgeous artwork that's a little bit different. I think there's room for all of that. And eBay just recently, we developed a piece that's 2-story, and it is not a mural, it's custom dyed ropes that create a really remarkable design on the wall. So it's it's changing. It's not quite as narrowly prescribed, but there still are trends that we see in different areas. Yes.
Just in relation to what you just mentioned, it's interesting that, for example, I looked at corporate collections and specifically banks, whether it's UBS or Deutsche Bank, and their headquarters, they have blue chip, which I have to say, coming from that historical side, it's universal. It's artists that have surpassed aesthetically, socially, and in many ways, i.e. Picasso, for example. They're artists that are universal for everyone. But I also very much enjoy the graffiti. But in the case of the corporate collections, I just realized that there was Simkovic, who's an art advisor. He actually mentioned, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but he said that the banks and all these law firms as well, they have all these offices, but the headquarters have the blue chip and the interesting universal art, and the corporate, and then the entrance to the retail banks, they have nothing. I mean, there's a poster to give you interest-free credit, but there's no painting of Picasso, and they show, you go to Art Basel, to the big art fairs, and they promote all of this, yet in their own retail banks, which is democratically speaking should be for the people, there's nothing. And I think it's very interesting, and I was very happy to hear that in both your cases, whether it's Google or GoDaddy, that you do promote, the Bruce from Roots Up artist. And now my question is, would you want to expand that to online? So in a way of doing like an art collection that you can show globally, and especially with Google having the monopoly almost of search engine, that you could open up the globe to everyone, because it's very hard, especially for people like me as an art dealer, to be able to get to everyone, and you've got that reach. That's been my question. And
it's a great question. So I do think there is an egalitarian ethos that the Silicon Valley and other tech companies apply that I think is chipping away, as Danielle talked about in the law firms as well. I think you'll see that more broadly, and I think banks in terms of a hierarchical structure are representing that hierarchical structure in how they are spending their money and how they're coming across to their customers. By the way, I do think Google has done some spectacular work in bringing not just their own artwork, but artwork around the world at significant expense to literally go create digitally perfect images of both artwork, sculpture, buildings around the world. Is it the Google Art Project that you can go online and see works without having to go to the museums and study them to the point where you can really get a sense like you were there with that painting. And so I think you all have done a very nice job of opening up, using the resources that Google has, the art world, and some works that are in very dangerous parts of the world, actually, and bringing them online for the rest of us.
Yeah, a lot of work has been done, and I think it's really exciting for me, just as an art enthusiast, to be able to explore museums I've never been to, and I've only started looking at the possibility of what we've put online. To your point about museum collections that I will likely never see in this lifetime. Your question also made me think about my experience working at Gap for years, and the Fishers' commitment to art is known pretty broadly in the Bay Area, and I just remember as an employee in the headquarters being able to go into galleries that we had on site at 2 Folsom. Without security, I felt so trusted that I could just be like right next to a Chuck Close or right next to whatever piece it was, a Gursky, and just and have my time and space with those pieces of art. That was a true gift to me as an employee there. And then I was kind of reflecting on in the retail store experience what you would find in a retail store, which is really more about what the store is there to do, which is sell the jeans and T-shirts. I think it's interesting when I think about the Fisher example of the huge investment they've made in the arts and in our local museum, et cetera, to provide access in a different way that's not within the retail store itself. Just has given me hope in how, just a few people with that kind of mindset can have an impact on how so many people have access to art in our Bay Area, even just alone.
Well, we can certainly take another question, but if there aren't any other questions, are there any other questions? Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to thank you for having the enthusiasm, the care, the commitment, the engagement, and the curiosity and interest in art, and what you're doing in bringing it to the companies that you represent is really remarkable, because it also brings it to all the employees, as you know, as it was pointed out here, and employees feel engaged, respected, and the level of care that goes into forming these art programs is really quite remarkable. And also, it matters to artists because their work ends up in these very fine collections. So, thank you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I just want to give you a quick update about tomorrow. We are having a whole another series of panelists, and that will begin at 1 p.m. on this stage. And we are going to have incredible artists talking about the evolution of digital art and art collecting. So they will be up here kind of debating the evolution of digital art and how we are collecting art. And that will be Marby, Nick Lynch, David Grine, and Not Human. And if you haven't seen their exhibits already, there's a lot of multimedia installations that you can go check out. And in case you missed it, our fantastic and generous partner, Porsche. Have you seen this car over here? It's incredible. They're offering an opportunity to win a Porsche for the weekend. So if you'd like to do that, go over there and check it out. And we just also got news that right behind that, Gemma Rolls Bentley will give a personal introduction to her movie Queertopia at 6. So if you'd like to hear on that, what's going on with that, that's going to happen at 6 p.m. And stick around. Tonight is going to be full with music. We're going to see, We're going to see DJ Shea Butter and at 6:15 p.m. and soul singer Rihanna J at 7 p.m. And San Jose Jazz has curated all of the music for this season or series, and it'll be a lot of fun. So we hope to see you there and enjoy the rest of the art for the evening. Thank you.